Hello everyone, good afternoon and great to see so many of you and thank you very much for tuning into our webinar. Today we're going to be discussing the statutory notices for consent for cryopreserved embryos and gametes and what you as an IVF clinic need to do to be compliant. We're just letting in delegates to the webinar and we'll start very shortly. If you have questions at any point during the webinar, please enter them into the chat box. We'd love to get your questions. In fact, we've already had quite a few in advance of the webinar, but there is room for more, so please just ask away. So please put those questions into the chat box and we'll answer these after the presentations. So good afternoon again and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Statutory Notices for Consent, What Your Clinic Needs to Do. I'm Emily Austin. I'm the General Manager of Cooper Surgical Fertility Solutions businesses in the UK, Ireland, Germany and the Alpine region. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today. We've been very much looking forward to this webinar. We've had a huge number of you sign up. This has proven to be a topic of high interest and we're really pleased to have assembled such a great panel of experts to discuss this subject. We've got some polls coming up, I think, shortly. So if you would like to complete these polls, we'd be very grateful. This will give us a baseline of information to guide today's discussion. So firstly, joining us in chairing today's meeting, we're delighted to have Steve Troop join us. Steve has nearly 40 years of experience in the field of fertility and a PhD in male infertility. Steve has risen through the embryology ranks to have been the scientific director of Liverpool Women's Hospital's Hewitt Fertility Centres and more recently IVI's when they opened in the UK. As well as his day-to-day operational and research responsibilities in both NHS-funded and private sectors, Steve has often provided advice to regulators, educators, the commercial sector and colleagues around the world. Steve is particularly proud to have been both chair and president of the Association of Clinical Embryologists and a founder member of the Association of Reproductive and Clinical Scientists, ARCS, from which he is recently delighted to receive honorary membership. Steve now works independently as a consultant reproductive scientist based in the UK. Thank you for joining us today, Steve. And we're also really pleased to say that we have joining us today Andrew Leonard. Andrew completed a biochemistry degree and doctorate looking into cell adhesion and behaviour on a novel biomaterial at Oxford University. Andy had a long postdoctoral research career at UCL Medical School, investigating maternal endocrinology and its impact on fetal development, as well as PCOS and resulting pathologies. He then worked as a scientific inspector at the HFEA for 15 years, during which he was involved in developing regulation and inspection methodologies in multiple areas such as imports and exports, donor screening, and responding to the legal changes resulting from Brexit and then the COVID pandemic. Andy left the HFEA in January 2023 and now acts as a consultant advising fertility clinics and their suppliers on their operations under HFEA regulation. Thanks so much for joining us, Andrew. We're also really pleased to have James Lawford-Davis joining us today. James has always worked in the health sector. After qualifying as a solicitor in 2000, he became increasingly specialised in the regulation of assisted reproduction and embryo research, and subsequently in broader human tissue and cell-based therapies and research. He later joined the litigation team at Clifford Chance before setting up his own niche life sciences firm in 2010. James co-founded Lawford Davis & Co in 2022, which became LDMH Partners in 2024. James advises a large number of clinics, hospitals, universities and researchers licensed by the HFEA and the Human Tissue Authority and the Care Quality Commission. He's been involved in most of the leading cases relating to assisted reproduction, embryo and stem cell research. He also advises on cell and gene therapies and on the regulation of medical devices and IVDs. Thank you so much for joining us today, James. And we have two of our colleagues joining us from Cooper Surgical. We've got Stacey McPherson joining us today. Stacey is the Clinical Applications Scientist for the UK and Ireland at Cooper Surgical Fertility Solutions. Stacey graduated from the University of Sheffield in 2009 and has worked in reproductive science since then. She has 14 years experience in the field of embryology. Stacey trained in the NHS, where she completed the ACE certificate and attained HCPC registration as a clinical scientist. In 2015, Stacey moved to a private fertility clinic in London, where she progressed from clinical embryologist to deputy lab manager. Stacey served on the professional body for clinical embryologists ACE committee from 2015 to 2018 as ACE webmaster. In her role as clinical application scientist, Stacey enjoys education and training, particularly in tracheostomy biopsy and vitrification. And we also have Julia Thomas joining us today. Julia gained her degree in pharmacology from the University of Portsmouth, UK, and has been working in the field of assisted reproduction since 2004. Julia started working with Cooper Surgical in 2009 and now specialises in the cryomanagement of cryopreserved samples in IVF clinics as Global Product Manager for Embryo Options. Embryo Options supports clinics to manage inventory effectively and utilise information and education to support the patient experience as part of their cryo journey. So just a quick reminder, please to enter your questions into the chat box. We'll answer as many as we can after the discussion. And yeah, so please ask away. Steve, I will now hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Emily. So just by way of introduction, I guess most of the attendees today work within IVF centres. Some will work in small centres, some will work in larger centres. But almost without exception, I guess, you will all be routinely freezing and storing embryos as part of your patient's treatment. And here in the UK, I think most of us would also agree that we are lucky to have a specific act of Parliament and a regulatory authority in the form of the HFEA that dictates what we can do with this stored material and how long it can remain in storage, for example. But of course, as soon as regulation exists, then complying with that regulation becomes absolutely essential. And I'm sure that this audience won't need to be told how much work is involved in achieving that compliance. And also, of course, the rules here have changed recently, which I'm sure everybody's aware of. And it's the way in which that compliance is achieved here in the UK in terms of patient involvement, clinic staff, dare I say, finance matters that we're going to concentrate on today. So I'd like to kick things off with some questions to our experts, and I'll come to you first, James, if I may. And I'll ask you I guess the obvious question, which is that when the transition period comes to an end at the end of this month, on the 30th of June, what does this mean for clinics, perhaps from a legal perspective?
Thanks. Well, it's a good question to start with. So I think there are two main things that spring to mind. The first is that the transition period was incorporated into the new rules to allow clinics to embed the new approach and the new periods for consent and the renewal of consent. But it was also, it's a slightly flippant phrase to use, but it was a bit of a get out of jail free card as well, because it meant that if there were embryos in storage or samples in storage that didn't have the correct paperwork, that could be rectified. And there was a period of time that created a new renewal period starting with the implementation of the rules, which allowed clinics time to contact patients, give them time to renew their consent if they wish to do so, and fix any problems that might have been lurking. Now, once that transitional period has come to an end, the get out of jail free card is taken away and doesn't apply anymore. And so if patients haven't renewed their consent to storage, the rules are slightly different depending on whether it's gametes or embryos. But come the end of the month, clinics will then have to act. And for the first time under the new system, gametes would have to be removed from storage on the 1st of July. Embryos, as I'm sure people are aware, can remain in storage for another 6 months. But at the end of that period, they will also have to be removed from storage if consent hasn't been renewed. The second consideration then is to make sure that there's a system in place so that going forwards from the start of next month, clinics are able to meet the statutory requirements and comply with the notice requirements under the new rules without relying on the transitional period and the provisions, the temporary provisions that were put in place under the new Act. So those are the two main things that spring to mind, and I anticipate that different size clinics will have different volumes of work that need to be done. I think one question that I have, without preempting another question from you, is what will happen after the 1st of July when older problems are discovered, and how those will be tackled. But we can come on to talk about that later if you wish.
In fact, I might quite like to talk about that now, because it is a burning issue. So what about some of the problems?
Well, I think, as I say, old cases that may relate to material that was stored a long time ago and where problems haven't yet been identified, I think those are going to be tricky. And patients will need to be notified of the consequences of that. I think I am concerned and anxious about how the exception for the additional storage period for embryos is going to work in practice, because I'm sure those watching will have seen the way in which the notices are phrased. And it's a little odd to send a notice to a patient to say, we are still storing your embryos and will continue to do so for another 6 months, but you can't renew your consent to those embryos and you can't use them. And in 6 months' time, we're going to dispose of them. I don't really understand the rationale behind that, other than to imagine that it was to recognize the special status of the embryo and to enable patients to take legal advice and possibly legal action if they wish to do so, to still be able to reconsent and use their embryos going forward. But I would anticipate that there must be some instances in the coming months where patients will receive one of these notices saying your embryos are going to be destroyed, and will be very upset about that. And then the other thing that I think is likely to be possibly problematic is how we deal with donors, and the fact that donors can consent to storage for 55 years, which is a very long period of time, and how you'll keep in touch with people for that length of time, given the difficulty we've historically had keeping in touch with donors for 10 years or shorter. I think that's going to be a challenge as well. But there are other problematic areas which we can go into later if they come up.
And just for clarity, at the end of that 6-month period, categorically, legally, the embryos will have to be removed from storage.
They will, and it's interesting. The turn of phrase changed slightly in the legislation, and emphasises the importance of disposing of that material once either consent is considered to have been withdrawn or that additional period has lapsed. But as I say, the notices are there to make sure that patients are given advance notice of the need to renew their consent, then notified if they don't consent, and then sent a notice to say that's it in relation to embryos. So hopefully they'll be given good notice. But, and this I suppose is another problematic area, it really, really highlights and emphasises the importance of making sure that clinics have up-to-date contact information for patients, because these statutory notices are only as good as the address that you have to send them to. So I think it really, really highlights the vital importance of clinics telling patients when they first consent that they've got to notify them if they move or change their contact details, or indeed change their relationships.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to that later, perhaps with Andy. So that there were some negatives in there. There's some difficulties, but I wonder, and also these new regulations are a huge amount of work for clinics. What are the benefits to patients of the new regulations, in your view?
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I sounded negative. I mean, it was actually really refreshing to see a change in the law that was so progressive, because it was that these new rules were introduced to address a shift in society, a move towards far more people storing gametes, particularly eggs, to preserve their reproductive choice for later in life, but also to address the impending problem of a lot of women running out of time and eggs having to be taken out of storage and destroyed before they'd perhaps met somebody or reached a point in their life when they wanted to use them. And so it is somewhat unusual to see government implementing rules which are intended to address that. And they did that in order to create more of a level playing field. So all patients that consent properly and that comply with the regulations are now able to consent for up to 55 years, providing they renew their consent at the intervals when they have to do so. I would say that it's not a straightforward framework. And so for clinics, I think it's a real challenge, and they're not easy rules to implement. I should also say that it was a system that wasn't designed by the HFEA. It was designed by the Department of Health, and the HFEA were given very short time to implement the new process, the guidance and the forms that everyone has to use. But it was well intentioned, and it intended to benefit patients and give patients more choice and freedom.
So just following on from that, then the role almost of the clinical teams within clinics is changing, and do you think they should have a greater understanding of the legality of what's going on here? And also, do you think that perhaps the people who are responsible for undertaking this within clinics, and we'll come on to that later, but do you think that they should perhaps be those that hold more responsibility within the clinic, rather than perhaps throwing this back to the admin teams?
Yeah, well, it's a big question. I think it's certainly another example of the field becoming more legal and legalistic in the way that it operates. By analogy, I deal with a lot of legal parenthood cases, and some people on the call may know that when you get that wrong, it often leads to all sorts of complications, which sometimes requires a court application and can be very costly and distressing for the patients affected. And I think this is very similar, where if clinics make mistakes in terms of sending out notices or dispose of material without patients being given the opportunity to renew their consent, I can see that being really problematic. And so compliance with these rules is very similar, I think, to making sure that legal parenthood forms are completed correctly, because the consequence of getting them wrong will be really significant and potentially very expensive. And the onus would then be on the clinic to rectify that problem as a result of it going wrong. So I really do appreciate how challenging it is for clinics taking on so many different regulatory and legal responsibilities, which require, a nurse to be an expert lawyer as well as a brilliant nurse, and an embryologist to be a brilliant barrister as well as a brilliant scientist. And that, it's no mean feat.
Absolutely. So another question: some clinics use their own consent forms. We understand, and these may be tied into contractual issues. So I wonder if you could just comment on the sort of contract versus consent issue that might arise here.
Yeah, in my experience, most clinics use their own forms alongside the HFEA forms. And it's sometimes a little complicated, but in essence, consent to the storage of embryos and gametes gives the clinic the legal basis for storing that material. And then the contract that runs alongside that determines the terms and the basis on which the clinic will continue to store that material. So if, for example, you have permission to store for 10 years, the contract says, but we'll only do that if you keep paying us every year to store, and they stop paying, then you're not obliged to continue to store for the duration of the consent. So they run in parallel, but they're mutually exclusive. So it's perfectly valid to store, but the patient must also comply with the terms that they've signed up to, which attaches. So on the one hand, you've got the very important HFEA forms that have to be correctly completed, but also the way in which the contract is drafted is also very important, because otherwise the clinics can find that they're a bit stuck if they haven't drafted that correctly.
Okay, and again, I guess an obvious question for you is what legal issues are you expecting to fall on your desk as a result of this? Perhaps the top one. What do you think? Where are the biggest problems going to be?
Well, I think the biggest in terms of impact is the one that I've already mentioned, which is the difficulty that is, I would think, very likely to arise where a patient receives a notice that their embryo is still in storage, but they can't use it or renew consent to the use of it. I think otherwise, the one area that I haven't mentioned is that when you talk about these rules, there is a natural tendency to focus very, very much on how these particular notices work and how the new storage rules work, possibly risking overlooking the fact that they still interact with all of the old consent rules about the information that needs to be given, the offer of counselling, the rights for patients to withdraw and vary their consent. And I think that interaction maybe warrants a little careful consideration by clinics about how that might work in practice. So if a patient decides actually they're not comfortable and want to withdraw or revise their consent, how that will feed into the renewal process and whatever system they put in place for consent and the renewal period.
Well, thanks very much, James, and for answering those questions so clearly. It's a complicated area. Andy, if I can come to you now, of course, many of the audience will know you already because of your time at the HFEA, but I think I should just emphasise that you no longer work for the HFEA.
Yeah, that's right, Steve. Yes, I stopped working there January 2023.
But it's your vast experience that we're going to tap into today, I hope. So I would like to start by asking you what you think clinics should have in place and ready for the end of the transition period at the end of this month.
Okay, Steve, thanks. I think James obviously has outlined the legal situation, effectively material which is stored, which expired before or during the consent period, the transition period. If renewed consent isn't provided by 30th of June, then that material is considered to have had its storage consent withdrawn from 1st of July onwards this year. And as such, gametes which are in that situation, statutory notices should have been sent out actually on the 1st of July 2023 regarding this stored material. And it should be clear then to the gamete providers what's going to happen to it if they don't renew consent, i.e. it will be considered that consent's been withdrawn. And actually gametes will need to be discarded, or gametes in this situation will need to be discarded from the 1st of July, or on the 1st of July. Embryos which are stored without any renewed consent, can remain in storage for another 6 months, but then will need to be discarded on 1st January 2025. Clinics will have to send out the NWC TP notice, statutory notice, to the relevant gamete providers for those embryos. That will have to happen as soon as possible after the 30th of June 2024. And that statutory notice will inform the gamete providers about effectively the consent withdrawal because they haven't renewed storage consent and the need to discard the embryos. The notice also will make clear if the earlier discard is wanted by the gamete providers, then they complete WCS forms, withdrawal of consent storage forms, and send them back to the clinic, and that will allow clinics to discard the embryos earlier. Obviously, there's a little bit of time left in which to obtain renewed storage consent, and so I think if I was inspecting now, I would expect clinics to have in place systems which they're working to look to obtain renewed storage consent up till the 30th of June. So in general, given all this, what I'd expect clinics to have in place would be, processes to accurately communicate statutory notices and other relevant information, and offers of proper counselling to patients at the required times, as dictated in law or by the clinic's own bring forward system, documented bring forward system. I'd expect them to be maintaining oversight on storage consent status for all stored gametes and embryos leading up to the end of the transition period, as well as on the communications which are sent out to relevant gamete providers regarding statutory notices, and also other information which has been sent to them. Effectively, all the information sent should be recorded in records. I'd expect processes to be in place to update storage consent status for each set of gametes or embryos stored, so that in response to communications from patients with completed consent forms and such, or the lack of them, the systems are in place to accurately update the storage consent status. So there should also be in place, I think, process for the accurate review of evidence for storage consent renewal or withdrawal. So not just putting it down to one person receiving consent forms and reviewing them, because actually we all know consent forms sometimes, it's got to be a valid consent form. Signatures have to be in the right place. It has to be the correct signature. So it needs to be checked against the patient record. The dates have to be right. And these all need to be checked. Sometimes valid consent isn't recorded. So it's only when clinics actually have checked that consent forms are valid that they should be updating their records. And obviously where consents aren't valid, they should be going back to the gamete providers and making sure that an accurate and valid consent is documented. Clinics are going to have systems in place to act on those withdrawal or updated consents, i.e. to update the records accurately. And obviously there's going to be a large number of samples potentially are going to need discard, gamete samples, discard on the 1st of July. So clinics are going to have to think how they're going to run that process effectively to ensure that actually on the 1st of July, there's clear evidence for samples that are lined up for discard, that there have been no communications, no renewal of consent, and that the proper process has been run through prior to the end of the renewal period. So that when a discard is made, and obviously that it's the right sample which is discarded, so that when a discard is made, it's quite clear that the sample or the gamete sample needs to be discarded. And obviously there's also the matter of the NWC TP POC notices, which will have to be sent out on the 1st of July to the relevant gamete providers where an embryo is in storage, but consent hasn't been renewed. So it's complex and a lot's going on for clinics.
I'll just pause you there. Essentially then, what you're saying is that clinics are going to be expected to have a complex and extensive system of processes, and all of which generate evidence that the HFEA may wish to see to show that process is working. And in your experience then, how are people achieving this? How might people be achieving this now? Are they doing it through automation, or are they doing this largely manually? What's your experience been?
Well, my experience over the years has been that on the whole, most clinics, they'll have a paper-based set of records regarding storage. There might even be some kind of, with freeze records and such like, and they're naturally operating generally Excel spreadsheets, listing samples which are stored, listing their geolocation, and also their storage consent status. And the Excel spreadsheet is what will be used to then generate a master list of gametes and embryos for which storage consent will have been sought. The Excel spreadsheets might well have been updated to log communications regarding statutory notices and comms back from the patients. It's quite a cumbersome system, would be my reflection. Obviously, some clinics will have adapted their electronic patient record systems to track storage consent status and the issuing of statutory notices. But roughly, from my perspective, about 25% of clinics were operating effective electronic patient record systems, and obviously their ability to adapt them to contribute in the renewal processes is quite difficult. They can't adapt them to be, certainly they're not providing a perfect support, which you'd ideally have for embryology teams going through these activities.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
difficult situation.
Absolutely. One thing that I did particularly want to ask you, and in fact James touched on this, is the delivery of statutory notices and the processes that might be expected to go through to make sure that these statutory notices are getting to the person that needs to receive them. So would you like to give us your views on that?
Well, statutory notices and other communications can be sent out obviously by land mail, sometimes registered, or manually by email. Now, in both cases, it's difficult. Like registered email, you can come back with either a signature from the recipient, and obviously the postman has actually gone to an address and said, right, we've got a registered mail for you. And it's not necessarily the person who's the individual who will sign for the receipt of that letter. Sometimes I know there's also an ability to take a photograph. Apparently, on the Royal Mail website discusses registered mail, and they'll take a photograph of who receives it. I think effectively the Royal Mail system is not cast iron. You don't get a clear indication that the letter has actually been delivered to the person who's meant to be receiving it. And you don't even know that that person, even if they have received it, has opened it and read it. So it is quite difficult. Obviously, these are legally defined documents. And I'm not sure whether clinics are making clear to their patients the essential requirements, which are, the legal requirement on the clinics to send out these notices, and they are actually important legal documents, and actually they contain very important information, obviously for the gamete providers to actually be reviewing. I think it's got to be clear information has to be given to patients going forward, that these notices actually have to be read and acted upon. I do notice some of the notices, all of them do actually make clear action is required. It's also buried in quite a lot of text, so I'm not even sure whether some people with, let's say, busy lives will actually get down through all the text to see that bolded statement that an action is required. But it's the best that can be done. For paper documentation, or obviously there's still that problem if it's sent out by email. Sending it to an email address allows you to actually, at least as long as it's a dedicated email address only opened by the gamete provider, it at least allows clinics to know when the email has been delivered, and it's going to be consistently delivered. Okay. Yeah.
So that's great. Well, thanks, Andy, for clarifying some of the practicalities around this very difficult issue. I'm seeing that we've got a huge number of questions coming in here. So what I'd like to do now, if I may, is to move on to our friends from Cooper Surgical. I'm not sure who's going first. Is it you, Julia?
It is me, if that's okay with everyone. And I'll just share my screen to have some slides up, because this is complicated, and I think it'll be easier with some diagrams and some documents and things like that. So just bear with me while I pop this into a nice, easy format for everybody's eyes to see. So interesting information, lots of information, lots to think about. And I think the questions that are popping in completely reflect that. So we have something that we think will be able to support the clinics as they go forward, and I'll aim to talk through this, and Stacey then will pick up and she'll take this from the point of the clinic, from the point of the embryologist, but pop some questions in if they come up. Now, many of you may have heard about the Embryo Options platform. That's the area of the business that I'm focused in. But if you haven't, I'll just take a step backwards so you can understand where we're coming from. So we're able to do many clever things with this. And if you think this is new into the UK and Ireland, you're absolutely right. We've just been working with some clinics here in the last 6 to 12 months. But actually, we've been using this platform for a really long time in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand now, and Australia. And we're speaking to a number of clinics in the UK and Ireland, Spain and Greece, many places in Europe. And I think it's reassuring to know that over 100 clinics and over 500,000 patients are managing their cryopreservation journey through the Embryo Options platform. So there's lots and lots of information and advantages and experience that we can bring to something like this. So, you know, I think we're in a really good place to take you to go forward. So what does it do? So there are 4 key areas, and this discussion slots ever so nicely into these. So the first thing that the Embryo Options platform will do is it will automate any billing that the clinic has for cryopreservation. So we're very used to sending out very consistent touch points for billing. We're making payment very simple. We're able to communicate with clinics regularly, so we make sure that we keep contact details up to date. We have ways of checking whether mail has landed or whether email has landed, whether email has been opened and read and how many times. So we do a really nice job of billing out patients when needed. And we see that clinics using Embryo Options, they collect a higher rate of payments than clinics that don't. Sometimes when patients aren't making a payment or they're not communicating in any way, there's a reason for that. And we want to be able to alert the clinic as quickly as possible if we see that, because we don't want the clinics building up an inventory of unpaid, overdue balances, or worse, unclaimed embryos. We don't want it to get to that point. In the UK, where we've got this specific period that we've got, we want to be able to support you to make sure that you can meet those points. And we want to be able to give you some guidelines and facilitate how that can happen. Talk to you about that in a bit more detail. Sometimes patients don't want to store anymore, and speaking to the clinic and getting round to making that call, that's quite a difficult thing to do. So what we want to be able to do in the platform is to be able to educate or inform the patients what the rest of their cryo storage journey can look like. And that might be around using their embryos or ending their storage. And we can do that in a really convenient way on a digital platform that they can do at their own pace and in their own home, you know, in a time that's suitable for them. And they're able to not just learn more about their options, but actually complete some of those consent forms that are set by the clinic and the HFEA. And lastly, the platform is here to be a resource. It's here to provide financial analysis. It's here to provide reports and all the different areas that the finance team will want to know to check that this is being effective. So lots of things we can do as teams, some things we have as standard, some things that we do as extra. But let's go back to the statutory notices now that you have a little bit of information around it. And what we want to be able to do is help facilitate the compliance to these statutory notices. We want to support you by bringing information in around consent start dates and consent time. We know that the HFEA renewal period is for 10 years, and what that means for the consent end date, but what it means for the whole HFEA renewal process. Andy and James have touched on, you know, who will be doing this in the clinics and how will they be doing this. And it's a very manual process. It sounds from the discussions that have been had already. So what we want to be able to do is find ways to streamline that, not to add any more administrative work into the clinics, and to automate it so that this process is happening without anybody having to remember that they need to send something out. And more importantly, perhaps for the PRs, the lab directors, the clinic directors, to give an overview of everything that's going on at every single stage, so you can quickly and clearly see what's happening within this whole process for each patient. And I know Stacey will go through that with you in just a little bit of time. So I think this is sort of the main reason for having some slides up, because I think it is a complicated process, and we've been trying to map this out. And thank you for all The people that have answered questions and given us some guidance of this, particularly our internal teams. But what the platform will do is it will take that consent start date and it will take the freeze date unless you tell it otherwise, and we have ways of doing that. And it will set that as the start of the process of this whole consent, this whole renewal period. So once the freeze happens and the consent date is started, you can pretty much forget about it because you'll have done your checks and Stacey will show you how this works, but this will then go and it will go dormant until it needs to be activated. The good thing that we have with clinics that are using the Embryo Options platform is that we're constantly contacting them because we're constantly billing out. So by the time the HFEA renewal period starts, we'll have made contact with these clinics many, many times if we're billing once a year or maybe even more frequently. So we're in a really good place to be sending out some of these statutory notices. So 13 months in advance of the consent end date, that first notice goes out, the RNE or the RNG, depending if you have embryos or gametes in store. If the patient, the accompanying email that goes with the statutory notice can be clinic designed, it can have the information in there. You can tell them how they can consent, who they need to contact. I think, Andy, you mentioned discussions around being able to offer counselling around this. All of that information can be included and it can be very clinic specific, you can choose. And if the patient chooses that they want to reconsent, then they contact the clinic as directed. And you as the clinic consent in your usual way, whether that's sending forms through email, perhaps you have an electronic platform that you use for that, you continue that in exactly the same way. When you are ready to set the new consent, there's a very easy function to do that within the platform that Stacey will talk you through. And then it goes quiet again until you're ready to have that process start again in the 10-year period. But if the patient doesn't decide to reconsent, the process will go through. So the renewal period will begin, we'll get to the consent end date, and the soonest date after the consent end date, which in this platform is the next day, that second notification will go out, that the NDE or the NDG. And if the patient doesn't communicate or there is no reconsent set up, then it will go through to that last point, to that NWC, where of course gametes become disposable, become eligible for disposal. And of course, 6 months after that, then the embryos will become eligible for disposal. What we want to make sure is that we find a way to support this process in a very clear and a very automated way so that we take that pressure out of the lab team, while still making sure that you're able to be meeting all of these guidelines and meeting all of this. I'm going to hand over to Stacey because she is the expert, having worked in the lab before, and she'll be able to tell you how this looks from the lab side. Thanks, Stacey.
Thanks, Julia. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, so you should be able to see my screen in presenter mode. Wonderful. Thank you, Julia. So my job today is to give you an idea as to how Embryo Options looks and feels when it's used and installed in a clinic. So Embryo Options connects to your EMR. So let's say you're in the lab, you're carrying out embryo freezes. You're then going to input those freeze events into your EMR. The following night, those freeze events will be inputted into Embryo Options. And the following day, somebody from your clinic can log into Embryo Options. They can review the freeze events that have taken place. And at this point, they can review and approve the consent period they would like to link to those freeze events. Now, Embryo Options can recognize when freezes have been carried out close together. So let's say you do a day 5 and a day 6 freeze for the same patient. Embryo Options will automatically link those freeze events. You can, of course, unlink them if you do not agree. So here we have an example of an active patient. This is Janet Doe. Embryo Options knows from your EMR that embryos are frozen on April the 16th, 2024. Somebody from your clinic has told Embryo Options the patient has a 10-year consent period. So the consent end date is April the 15th, 2034. Now, it is possible to input a consent period of less than 10 years into embryo options. But today we're going to focus on the 10-year consent period under the assumption that that's probably what most of your patients are likely to consent to. Now, if you click on the patient summary tab, you see the following drop-down. This is a timeline, and it's essentially very similar to the timeline that Julia shared with you earlier in this webinar. On this timeline, you can see the patient's consent period start date and their consent period end date. The renewal period is indicated to you by the box. You can see the dates the statutory notices are scheduled to go out. So in this example, we have the RNE, the NDE, and the NWC notification. Now, when these dates arise, Embryo Options will auto-populate the statutory notification and automatically send them out to your patient by email. If those emails are delivered, this will be indicated to you by a green tick next to the notification date. If Embryo Options is unable to deliver those emails, this will also be highlighted to you by a yellow exclamation mark. When somebody in your clinic sends out a consent form, this can be logged in Embryo Options by pressing the blue button here. This timeline continues until the embryos are no longer in storage in accordance with your EMR, or until the 55-year mandatory end of storage date is reached. Within each patient's profile, you'll find an activity tab, and this documents who has done what and when to create a full audit trail for peace of mind. So you can see here staff member W. Baker created a consent period, and this is date and time stamped. It is possible to add manual entries, so if you call or write to the patient, you can document it here. And this page can be exported via PDF or printed for your medical records. Embryo Options works with your clinic to make sure all communications are tailored to your liking. All emails can be personalized by you. So here you can insert the clinic's name and logo. You can adjust the text in the email to put it in your own language and to communicate whatever it is you'd like to say to the patient through this channel. The home page of Embryo Options is a dashboard for every user. It contains summary tables that may be relevant to different staff members. So let's say, for example, you're in the finance team. You might be interested in the billing table. You might want to look at patients with outstanding balances. Or let's say you're the CFO or the owner of a clinic. You might be more interested in the financial summary. You may want to look at collection rates to see how things have hopefully improved with the installation of Embryo Options. But today we're focusing on compliance support. So the person in your clinic responsible for statutory notices may wish to look at this table here. They may want to look at consents with upcoming notices. As an example, it might be that you want to call these patients weekly in accordance with your local SOP. Or you might want to look at freezes eligible for disposal in accordance with the Embryo Options compliance support timeline. You could export this list of patients and review them and process them in accordance with your own practices and policies. So today we've given you just a small taste of what Embryo Options can do. There are many more elements to Embryo Options that can support cryo management in your clinic. Embryo Options is moving cryobilling into the digital age. It offers cryobilling and compliance support. We're using a digital platform to ease your workload, support compliance, and to help connect you closer to your patients. Thank you for listening.
Right, thanks very much, Stacey and Julia, for taking us through Embryo Options. It would be wrong for me to offer an opinion, but I know what I'd be buying next. We've got a huge list of questions. There are now over 30 questions to answer, so we're not going to be able to do them all. But the panel have very kindly offered to reply by email to these questions. So thanks to everyone that sent them in, and we'll get answers to you. But there are some, there are perhaps one or two themes, common questions that are arising. The first is perhaps to you, James, if I may, and it's around the practicalities of dealing with what might be a huge number of embryos that need to be discarded in a large clinic, and what is the sort of slippage time that might be allowed around that, or is there any?
Well, Andy might have a view on this from the HFEA's perspective as a former inspector. There isn't a a sort of legal slippage time, but I appreciate that there may be a practicality that would prevent everything being dealt with on the same day. As far as the law is concerned, the day that storage becomes unlawful should be the day that material is disposed of. But I do fully appreciate that might be totally impractical in some clinics. But Andy, do you know if the authority has a view on that?
Yeah, James, kind of like, certainly on the inspection team, we used to have it's a question of practicalities. Effectively, if clinics discarded on a weekly rota, and so things might be a few days late when they were discarded, that was considered acceptable. I think the maximum might be out to 2 weeks, but it's always got to be remembered that the law is quite clear. The materials, if it's not got storage consent, it's unlawfully stored. So these were very much reasonable. Well, one would consider as an inspector who applied these types of slight wriggle room, let's say, kind of like a week, was a reasonable acceptance of the practicalities of discards in clinics. I think anything beyond a week or two would be considered non-compliant, definitely. Obviously, I left the HFEA kind of like almost, well, a year and a half ago, and it might be that a different view is being taken as well. So it'd be interesting. Certainly, I will touch base with colleagues and actually find out if that, or ex-colleagues, and find out if that's the case, I think. Yeah, there's not much wriggle room. And as I said, the law is pretty clear, isn't it?
No, I suspect this might be an issue for some clinics, because disposing of embryos is not a quick process, as you've mentioned, James. You have to be absolutely certain that you're disposing of the correct embryos, and all the paperwork needs to be in place. Okay, just moving on to a practicality. Someone has asked, how do we bring in all our existing data? Julia, perhaps you could answer that. Into embryo options, sorry.
Into embryo, yeah. No, that's a really good question, actually. I'm really glad somebody's asked that, because we have a team, we're used to doing this. So we do this routinely when we onboard clinics, for using it for all the other features that we talked about just earlier. So we have a dedicated customer success team. A dedicated part of that is with onboarding. We can utilize your EMR system or any other way that you're storing that information. And we have a really nice team of people that work with you to do this in a very structured and a very careful way. So this is actually an expertise of ours, so don't be worried about that. We'll be holding your hand all the way through it. Yeah, super easy to do.
And therefore, just another quick question, does Embryo Options interface with Ideas?
It does. It interfaces with many EMRs. It's a very simple thing to do, but absolutely, Ideas is one we come across all the time. Yeah, super popular. Okay,
and another question, again, perhaps to James and Andy. The consent, storage start and end dates are key dates that needs to be entered into Embryo Options without any mistake. Otherwise, the whole thing crashes around our ears. So how would you like to see those being entered into that system? In terms of, is it just one person that does it? Does it need to be witnessed, or that type of thing? Because it's so important.
I would suggest a witnessing type approach is taken. At least two people should be reviewing the evidence for consent renewal or for a new sample for consent, and actually making sure that the storage period is accurately calculated, so the consent expiry date, which is then entered into Embryo Options. And this should be double checked, because obviously the way that the Embryo Options systems works, that date has to be accurate, because obviously the statutory notices are sent out in an automated way, and wrong date, then you're sending out your notices at the wrong times, and that might actually prove to be illegal, cause legal problems. James,
yeah, well, there's no statutory requirement for witnessing, but it's clearly a good idea to make sure that the system is robust. There is really useful HFEA guidance on the clinic portal, which does explain how to calculate the dates if anyone is confused about that. But yeah, anything that can be done to make it as robust and reliable as possible would be wise.
I'm just using chair's prerogative to pick some very interesting questions. There's one come in here. Are patients allowed to transport their embryos outside the UK between the 30th of June and the 31st of December 2024 while they can store them but cannot use them? So can they export embryos in that 6-month period, James?
I don't know the answer to that. I would imagine they would require special directions, and I imagine they wouldn't be granted. Again, Andy, I don't know if you have a thought about that, but I think that's if it was as easy as that to get around the statutory bar on them being renewed or used, then I imagine the guidance would have addressed that. But I would assume that any attempt to either renew consent, use the embryos, or export them would require a court declaration to make that permissible.
Yeah, I wouldn't add to that, James. I think you got it right on, as I'd expect you to do. Yeah, General Direction 6 requires that there's at least 6 months storage consent remaining on a sample if it's to be exported under the authorization of General Direction 6. So that would be out, therefore a special direction would be required. And I'm not sure what position the authority would take on whether it approved such special directions. However, I suspect, given the new law, then they wouldn't. I suspect they wouldn't approve it. But yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, I think we are nearly at the end. I'd just perhaps like to finish by asking our experts, James and Andy. I suppose I've already given my view about embryo options. I think it's something which could certainly enable clinics to sort of fight their way through this massive task more easily. And I just wondered whether, I know, James, you haven't seen this system before, but following Julia and Stacey's presentation, whether you had a view, and then the same to Andy.
Yeah, and well, it was a great overview. I'd love to have a play with it and see what it's like in practice, but it looks great. And my non-expert view is that anything in terms of the IT side, as a lawyer, anything that can be done to ensure or maximize compliance and help clinics meet their statutory obligations and comply with the guidance in the HFEA is a good thing. Obviously, that relies on it being reliable, robust, and compliant as a platform, but clearly a lot of thought has gone into how it works and what it looks like. So I've no doubt it will be.
Andy?
Yes, certainly I would see it as being a key advantage to clinics in reducing the amount of manpower they need to run their storage systems and maintain kind of compliant storage consents. The fact is that the system is sending out your statutory notices for you, maintaining contact. You're seeing reports in embryo options which make clear what contact points have been had with patients. So when it comes to discards, I would have thought it's a very useful resource at that point to be able to look at all the evidence that you have for whether the renewal pathway was followed accordingly, whether there have been any contacts back to the clinic to renew consent, and therefore, in terms of giving confidence at discard, it would be extremely useful. And obviously, just the fact it's taking out of the hands of embryologists or administrators the general billing which goes on for storage. I would have thought that would lead to embryologists being able to focus on what they're good at, which is generating high quality embryos and assisting people in their fertility care.
Lovely. Well, thanks very much, James and Andrew, for your expertise. I'll hand back to Emily now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. Appreciate that. Well, that was very interesting, and I'm sure very helpful for our delegates. So thank you very much to our panel. A massive thank you to our very special guests, Andrew and James, who've all benefited hugely from your expertise today. And thank you very much to you, Steve, super chairing for us as always. And thank you to Julie and Stacey for sharing your product knowledge and expertise. And also thank you very much to our marketing manager, Tenna, who has organised and run the webinar today. We've never received so many questions in a webinar. I'm quite overwhelmed by that. So if there's more that you would like to know about Embryo options, or if you'd like a demonstration of the software, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us here at Cooper Surgical. You can speak to your account manager or email us at marketinguk@coopersurgical.com. We're all about innovation here at Cooper Surgical, and our next webinar is entitled From Embryo to Endometrium, and will be on the subject of how cytokines can help fertility patients. This will take place on July 2nd at 12:30. We have Dr. Catherine Pretty joining us from CARE. Thank you to Catherine, and also Dr. Steve Fleming, Director of Embryology, Cooper Surgical Fertility Solutions, and Stacey will be joining us again for this one. If you'd like to be kept up to date with our webinars and in-person events, then you can do so by signing up to our fortnightly news bulletin. To be registered to receive this, just send an email to our marketing department, marketinguk@coopersurgical.com, or ask your account manager to be signed up. So it just remains me to say thank you very much to you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have your company. Thank you so much again for those varied and interesting questions. And we look forward to seeing you again very soon, either in a webinar or in person. Take care.